The call came at 8:47 p.m. on a Thursday. Not a text, not an email. A call to the landline, which almost nobody had the number for anymore. I remember looking at the handset for a moment before I picked it up, the way you look at something ordinary that has somehow become unfamiliar. The kitchen was quiet. I had made dinner for two and eaten it alone. A glass of red wine, barely touched, sat on the counter beside Claire's plate, which I had kept warm in the oven for 45 minutes before accepting that she wasn't coming home at 7 like she'd said. Or 7:30 or 8, I picked up on the third ring. "Good evening. Is this the Cole residence?" "It is," I said. "I'm sorry to call so late. My name is Patrick Osai. I'm Claire's supervisor at Hartwell and Associates. I'm trying to reach her about something fairly urgent. Is she there by any chance?" I stood at the kitchen counter for a moment with the phone against my ear and the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. "She told me she was working late," I said. "I assumed she was with you." There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause that carries a full conversation inside it. "No," Patrick Osai said carefully. "Claire left the office at 5:15 this afternoon. I haven't been able to reach her since." I thanked him. I told him I would pass the message along. I set the phone down on the counter with the particular deliberateness of a man who understands, in that exact moment, that the version of his life he went to sleep believing in last night no longer exists. The wine on the counter had gone the temperature of the room. I poured it down the sink. That was the beginning of the end of my marriage, and the beginning of everything else. What Patrick Osai didn't know, what nobody in that world knew, was that I had suspected something was wrong for nearly 4 months before that phone call. I had gathered the evidence with the same unhurried precision I bring to every project I take on. I had built a file, verified its contents, and waited, not out of indecision, out of patience, because I am an architect. I do not demolish a structure until I have studied every load-bearing wall. I do not swing a hammer until I know exactly which blow will bring the whole thing down cleanly. By the time Patrick Osai called my house, I already knew about Julian Hargrove. I already knew about the hotel on Devereux Street where they had met 11 times in the past 16 weeks. I already knew about the conversation Claire had with her mother in late September, 3 weeks before the phone call, when she had outlined, in calm and specific terms, her plan to leave the marriage as soon as the timing was right. I knew all of this because I had built my understanding of the situation the same way I build everything, carefully, quietly, and from the foundation up. What Claire and her family did not know was what I had been building while they were busy deciding I wasn't enough. What none of them knew, not her father with his investment properties and his tailored suits, not her brother with his loud opinions and his borrowed confidence, not Claire herself with her careful silences and her 5:15 exits from an office she'd told me she was still sitting in at 9, was that while they had been measuring my worth by my salary and dismissing my potential and planning my replacement, I had been quietly constructing something that would make every assumption they had ever made about me look like rubble. But I am getting ahead of myself. Before we go any further into Nathan and Claire's story, we want to take a moment to ask, where are you watching from tonight? These stories travel to the most extraordinary corners of the world, and it genuinely means everything to us to know who is out there. Drop your city or your country in the comments below. We read every single one. And if this kind of story resonates with you, if you've ever stood alone in a quiet kitchen and felt the architecture of your life shift beneath your feet, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. It's the best way to make sure you never miss a story like Nathan's. Now, let's go back to the moment everything changed. My name is Nathan Cole. I am 39 years old. I have been an architect for 14 years, and I have been in love with the same woman for 9 of them, 6 of which we spent as husband and wife. I met Claire Ashworth at a mutual friend's dinner party in the spring, and I remember thinking that she was the most self-possessed person I had ever watched walk into a room. She didn't perform her entrance. She simply arrived, looked around once, decided what she thought, and went to find a drink. There was something about that quality of stillness, that internal confidence, that I found more compelling than anything I had encountered in years. I introduced myself before the starter was served. She told me later she had already noticed me across the room. We dated for 14 months. She met my family in the 3rd month. I met hers in the 6th. I should say something about the Ashworths because they matter to this story in a way that will become clear. Richard Ashworth, Claire's father, was a self-made property developer who had constructed his fortune over 30 years of acquiring undervalued commercial plots and building them into spaces the city's wealthier residents would want to occupy. He was 61 years old, physically large, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes from being the most financially successful person in most rooms he entered. He was not a cruel man, exactly. He was something more specific than cruel. He was a man who had decided, somewhere in his late 30s, that financial output was the only meaningful measure of a man, and who had never subsequently encountered enough evidence to revise that view. Claire's mother, Helen, was quieter, warmer, and more observant than her husband. I liked her at first. I would come to revise that opinion. Marcus, Claire's younger brother, was 28, worked in his father's development company in a title that sounded senior but functioned primarily as a vehicle for Richard's nepotism, and was the loudest person in any gathering. He had the specific cruelty of someone who has never once had to earn the room he's standing in. When I married Claire, I married all of them. That is always the unspoken clause in the contract. Our early marriage was good. I want to say that clearly and without qualification because it matters that the betrayal happened to something real. We were not a couple performing a relationship for external approval. We had a life together, quiet dinners, long arguments about nothing important, a running joke about leftover Thai food that somehow survived 3 moves, a dog named Pip that we both loved more than either of us would admit. We had years that were genuinely worth having. But there was a pressure in the background that I can see more clearly now than I could then. The Ashworths had a specific idea of what a successful man looked like, and that picture was built in their own image. It meant property, it meant a recognizable firm, it meant tangible, visible, quotable success, the kind that could be mentioned at dinner parties without explanation. My architectural work was respected in the circles I moved in. But I ran my own small firm, which Richard had begun calling my little office within 6 months of my wedding. I drove a car that was 8 years old and well maintained. I declined family holidays to the Ashworth Villa in Tuscany 3 years running because the dates conflicted with project deadlines. These were not marks against my character, in my view. They were evidence that I was building something. The Ashworths experienced them as evidence that I was failing. The first time Richard offered me a job, an actual, formal offer, delivered over a Sunday roast in their dining room with the whole family present, I was 34 years old and had just won a regional design award for a community library project in the city's Eastern District. The offer was for a project management role at Ashworth Developments. He called it a more stable footing. I thanked him and declined. He nodded in the way of a man who has just had a suspicion confirmed. I did not know then that he had already begun having that conversation with Claire in private. I did not know then that Claire had begun listening. There were specific moments, scattered across our early marriage, that I look back on now and read differently than I read them then. A comment Helen made at Sunday lunch in our second year, something about how she had always worried that Claire had too many choices when it came to men, said lightly, in the way of women who have learned to land knives sideways. A conversation Richard had with me at the golf club the one time I agreed to play, in which he had walked me through, in some detail, the annual earnings of every man he considered a peer, as though the information was a gift rather than an assessment. The fact that Marcus at every gathering addressed me last. I do not share these things to perform victimhood. I share them because they are structural. Every building I have ever designed begins with a forensic reading of the site, its history, its pressures, its hidden tensions, the things it has been asked to bear, and how those demands have shaped it. You cannot design well without understanding honestly what you are working with. And what I was working with, I now understand, was a family that had built its identity on a very specific foundation, and that experienced anything which did not confirm that foundation as a category error that needed correcting. I tried for several years to be a different kind of correction, to show them through the quiet accumulation of my work that their framework was incomplete. I thought patience was enough. I thought that eventually the work would speak and they would hear it. I was wrong about eventually. I was right about everything else. It was not the phone call that first told me something was wrong. It was a parking receipt. 6 months before Patrick Osei called my house, I found a parking receipt in the interior pocket of Claire's coat while I was putting it away after she'd left it on the hook by the door. It was dated on a Wednesday evening, a Wednesday on which she had told me she was at her colleague Diane's birthday dinner in the city center. The receipt was from a car park on Devereux Street in the River Quarter, a neighborhood I knew reasonably well because it contained several of the city's better hotels and a cluster of high-end restaurants. The timestamp showed she had entered at 6:34 p.m. and exited at 10:51 p.m. I put the receipt back in the pocket. I hung up the coat. I went to bed. The next morning, I looked up the car park on Devereux Street. It primarily served 3 establishments: a Japanese restaurant, a private members bar, and the Alderton Hotel, which charged £420 per night for its river-facing suites. I did not confront Claire. I began instead to pay attention with the particular focused quality I bring to structural problems. Quietly, without urgency, without, I want to be clear, any pleasure in the task. It is a miserable thing to look at your own marriage through the lens of an investigation. Every ordinary moment acquires a different texture. Every explanation sits slightly differently in the air. Over the following 8 weeks, I identified 4 more evenings whose accounts did not hold up under scrutiny. I noted the dates. I noted the discrepancies. I did not act. Then, on a Saturday afternoon in early October, I was sitting in my home office, a small room on the first floor that Claire had always mocked gently for its organized chaos of blueprints and scale models and post-it note systems, working on a set of structural revisions for a project downtown. My laptop was open. I had 3 browser tabs running. I minimized one by mistake and found, below it, a browser window Claire had apparently left open on my computer when she had used it the previous evening to print something. It was a Google Maps search. The destination was the Alderton Hotel on Devereux Street. The saved route showed her starting point as our house. She had forgotten to close the tab. I sat in my office and looked at it for a long time. Outside, Pip was scratching at the garden door to be let in. The October light was low and honey-colored through the window. Everything was very ordinary. Everything was very still. I closed the tab. I let the dog in. I sat back down at my desk and looked at the revision drawings for 20 minutes without seeing them. Then I picked up my phone and sent a message to a man named David Chen. It said, "I think I need to bring you up to speed on something. Dinner this week." David replied within 3 minutes. "Tuesday, usual place, 7:30. I should tell you about the months that preceded all of this, because the parking receipt and the phone call from Patrick Osai were not the only injuries I was absorbing during this period. They were simply the most legible ones. The Ashworth family had been conducting a quieter campaign against my sufficiency for considerably longer. It had its official opening at Christmas, 2 years before the phone call, when Richard held his annual family dinner at the house in Hertfordshire. A Georgian pile that he had purchased in the 90s and renovated with the maximalist enthusiasm of a man who had not grown up with money and had subsequently decided he would never again live without the visible evidence of it. 30 guests, a caterer, an open bar stocked with scotch that cost more per bottle than my first monthly rent. At some point during the meal, Richard stood and gave his annual address, a tradition that the family received with the practiced warmth of people performing rituals they have long since stopped feeling. He toasted the year's achievements. He praised Marcus for closing a deal on a mixed-use development in Bristol. He described in admiring detail the investment portfolio of a cousin's husband who had made what Richard called serious money in logistics. He did not mention me. What he did, and I noticed it with the same careful neutrality with which I had begun to notice everything, was look at me twice during the toast. Not with hostility, with something more specific than hostility. With the appraising, mildly disappointed look of a man checking a structural survey and finding the foundations less solid than he'd hoped. After dinner, Marcus found me on the terrace with a glass of wine, and in the particular spirit of bonhomie that expensive Scotch lends to naturally cruel men, he clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You're a funny one, Nathan. You've got the talent, you've got the brain, you just don't seem to want to use them properly." I looked at him. "My dad has a mate who runs a residential architecture firm in Surrey," he continued. "Bread and butter stuff, extensions, conversions, that sort of thing. Good steady work. I could put your name in if you want the stability." He meant it as a kindness. That was the worst part. He genuinely believed he was offering something I needed. "Thank you," I said. "I'm all right." He shrugged and went back inside, and I stood on the terrace in the winter air for a few minutes longer, looking out at the garden, my hand resting in my jacket pocket around the small hard rectangle of the titanium keycard that I had carried for the past 18 months. Its cool, smooth surface under my thumb. A private steadiness in a family that had decided I was the wrong kind of man. The second incident came in February, at a dinner that Claire's parents hosted for what Richard called the extended circle, a semi-regular gathering of his friends, business associates, and extended family that functioned as an informal exhibition of the Ashworth brand. I had attended 3 of these dinners. I had learned to treat them as fieldwork. At this dinner, the conversation turned, as it always did in Richard's orbit, to property. Who was building what? Who had sold what? Who was sitting on what portfolio? There was a man named Gerald Prentice at the table, a commercial developer Richard had known for 20 years, who mentioned that his firm had submitted a bid for a major municipal contract, a new civic center for the city council, a project I happened to know in some professional detail because I had reviewed the preliminary brief. Significant project, I said, setting down my fork. The structural challenges on that site are interesting. The groundwater table on the eastern section is going to add considerable complexity to the foundation design. There was a brief pause. Richard looked at me with the particular patience of a man choosing not to say something. Gerald Prentice said politely, "Nathan, what kind of work is it you do?" "Architectural design," I said, "commercial and residential. I run my own practice." "Ah," Gerald said, not unkindly, just the syllable that people produce when a thing they assumed has been confirmed. Later that evening, as the guests were leaving, I was in the hallway collecting coats when I heard Richard's voice from the drawing room, not raised, simply carrying, the way the voices of men who are accustomed to being listened to tend to carry. "He's like a comfortable old chair," Richard was saying. "Kind, predictable, you wouldn't throw it out, but you wouldn't build a room around it either." There was a low ripple of laughter from the room. I recognized Helen's voice in it. And then, softer but unmistakable, I recognized Claire's. I stood in the hallway with a woman's overcoat in my hands and said nothing and did nothing and felt the thing I always felt in these moments. Not rage, not humiliation, but a long, cold settling. The way a foundation settles, the weight of it pressing everything below it into something harder and more permanent than it was before. I went back in, handed out the coats, thanked everyone for coming, and drove my wife home in silence. She asked if I was all right. "Fine," I said, "just tired." She nodded and looked out of the passenger window at the moving dark. The third incident was the most precise, and it happened because Marcus had been drinking. It was a Sunday in April, 4 months before the Patrick Osai phone call, and we had gathered at the Ashworth house for a birthday lunch for Helen. Marcus arrived 40 minutes late in a suit he had clearly slept in, poured himself a large glass of wine without greeting anyone, and settled into the chair beside me at the lunch table with the territorial ease of a man who has never once in his life felt unwelcome anywhere. By the main course, the conversation had turned to a hypothetical. If money were no object, what would you build? Richard spoke about a hotel development he had been considering in the south of France. Marcus described with theatrical detail a penthouse conversion he had apparently been fantasizing about. Various others contributed. Claire stayed quiet in the way she sometimes did, watching, present in a way that left no trace. Marcus turned to me. "Go on then, Nathan," he said. "What's your magnum opus? What's the great project that's going to make the name Cole synonymous with greatness?" He smiled as he said it. He had a gift for phrasing generosity so that it carried its own built-in answer. "I'm working on something," I said. "Oh, he's working on something," Marcus repeated to the table with the bright, delighted cruelty of a man who has found exactly the right pressure point. "Aren't you always, what was it last year, the Riverside Regeneration pitch, the community center, what happened to that?" "The budget was restructured by the council," I said evenly. "It's common in public sector work, right?" "Common?" He drank. "Nathan, I say this with love, you're a brilliant man who designs absolutely spectacular things that somehow never quite get built. Have you considered that perhaps the commercial instinct just isn't?" He waved his hand. "There, I know a man at Ashworth who handles our graphics work. Residential renders, that kind of thing, pays well, stable, you'd be good at it." The table had gone the specific quiet of people who are not quite willing to intervene but are aware they should be. Richard said nothing. Claire looked at her plate. I looked at Marcus for a moment. He held my gaze with the comfortable confidence of a man who has never once experienced real consequences. "I appreciate the thought," I said. My hand was in my jacket pocket. My thumb was on the key card. Its titanium surface was cool and exact and still. Marcus topped up his wine and moved the conversation on, and I remained at the table for another 2 hours, eating Helen's birthday cake, listening to the family talk about things that mattered to them. And I said very little, and I was very calm, and if any one of them had been paying careful enough attention, which they were not, they might have read in my stillness something that was not the resignation they had decided it was. The fourth incident is one I have never told anyone about, not because it was the most severe, it was not, but because it involved Claire directly in a way that the others did not, and because it told me something I had been reluctant to understand. It was a Sunday evening in June, 3 weeks before the overheard phone call, and we were at home, just the two of us. I had been in the office until late on Friday and all of Saturday, working on a revised set of structural specifications for the Meridian construction team, drawings that represented, in their way, the most consequential technical work of my professional life. I had come home on Saturday evening with blueprints rolled under my arm and the kind of bone-deep tiredness that comes from doing something that matters very much for a very long time. On Sunday, I sat at the kitchen table and spread some of the drawings out, not to continue working, just to look at them. There is a satisfaction in looking at a thing you have made that is difficult to describe and impossible to replicate with anything else. I was doing that, quietly, with a cup of coffee while the morning came through the garden windows. Claire came downstairs, saw the drawings on the table, and said, not unkindly, but with the specific tiredness of someone managing a habit they've decided they don't have the energy to argue about, "Can you put those away before we eat?" I looked at her. "They're everywhere," she said. "It's Sunday." I rolled the drawings up. I put them in the office. I came back and poured her coffee. We ate breakfast in the easy, comfortable quiet that we had always been good at, and she talked about something she had read, and I listened and responded, and the morning passed the way mornings do. But I sat across from my wife at that kitchen table and understood, with a clarity I had been building toward for some time, that she had looked at the drawings for the most significant architectural project in the city's modern development history, sitting on her own kitchen table, and her first thought had been whether they were in the way. She did not know what she was looking at. She had never known, and she had never, I understood then, particularly wanted to. That is its own kind of loss, not the dramatic kind. The quiet, morning-light kind that sits in the room with you long after breakfast is over. But it was the conversation I was never supposed to hear that sealed everything. 3 weeks after Helen's birthday lunch, on a Wednesday evening when I arrived home early from a site visit that had concluded ahead of schedule, I came through the side door of the house that opened into the utility room off the kitchen. Claire did not hear me come in. She was in the kitchen, her back to me on the phone. Her voice was low and I caught only the end of it, but the end was enough. "I just need a little more time, Mum. Once the Meridian project is announced and his profile goes up, the settlement is going to be significantly more complicated. I need to time it properly. Julian and I have talked about it." A pause. I know. But I'm not going to leave money on the table out of impatience. I stood in the utility room. "He has no idea," Claire said. "He's been completely absorbed in whatever he's building. He barely notices anything outside that office of his. It's actually," she laughed softly, a sound I had loved for 6 years, "it's actually easier than I thought it would be." I went back out through the side door. I sat in my car in the driveway for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I watched the clock. At the end of those 11 minutes, I felt the last of something leave me, the last degree of doubt, the last small reservation, the last fraction of hope that there was another explanation for the parking receipts and the hotel maps and the 515 exits. It left cleanly the way load leaves a demolished wall, all at once, suddenly, and without residue. I did not feel grief, not yet. I felt instead a profound and almost architectural clarity. I knew exactly what needed to be built. On the Thursday after I overheard Claire's phone call, the same Thursday that Patrick Osai would later call the house, I sat in my office at the firm until past midnight. My firm, Cole Architecture and Associates, operating commercially since I was 27 years old, headquartered in a Georgian townhouse on Cavendish Street that I had purchased and renovated at 32, funded by a small business loan and the sale of my first major residential commission. The building that everyone in Claire's family had at various points called my little office, my little venture, my little practice. That night I opened the private portfolio server that only David Chen and I had access to. I logged in using my key card, the brushed titanium rectangle I had carried in my jacket pocket for 18 months, since the day the Meridian Development Agreement was signed. I placed the card on the desk beside my keyboard under the desk lamp and looked at it for a moment before I opened the files. Then I looked at the files. The Meridian Project. A 47-story mixed-use development on the city's former industrial waterfront, residential units, commercial space, a public arts facility, a sky bridge connecting to the existing transport network. 6 years of design work, 3 years of planning negotiations, 2 years since the council had approved the master plan, 14 months since the construction contract had been awarded, due to break ground in 11 weeks. Total development value, £342 million. Cole Architecture and Associates held the lead design contract. We also, through a holding company called Cavendish Strategic, a name chosen for its connection to the street where my little office stood, held a 17% equity stake in the development, purchased quietly over 4 years at a total cost of £11 million. David had structured the stake. The solicitors had been meticulous. The holding company name appeared nowhere in any public filing that linked directly and immediately to my name. 17% of £342 million at projected completion represented a return of £58,140,000. I sat at my desk in the quiet office and looked at these numbers the way I look at the structural drawings of a building I have designed, with the exact, unsentimental satisfaction of something correctly made. The titanium key card lay beside my keyboard under the lamp, its surface catching the light. I picked it up, turned it over once in my fingers, put it back in my jacket pocket. Then I opened a new document and began to write. David Chen arrived at the restaurant on Tuesday at exactly 7:30. He was 42 years old, wore the same rotation of dark wool suits, and had the specific quality of stillness that belongs to men who are genuinely comfortable with silence. He had been my business partner for 11 years, my closest friend for 14, and the only person in my life who understood the full picture of what coal architecture had become. He sat down, ordered water, looked at me across the table and said, "How bad?" "She's planning to leave," I said. "She's been seeing someone for at least 4 months, possibly longer. She's timing the divorce to avoid complications from the Meridian announcement." David was quiet for a moment. "She knows about Meridian. She knows something is coming. She doesn't know the scale." "Nobody outside this table does," he nodded slowly. "And the equity stake, the Cavendish filing? Clean. The chain from Cavendish to me takes a qualified solicitor and 3 hours to trace. She's not going to find it before I want her to." David poured his water. "So what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking there are 2 separate problems," I said. "The marriage, which is finished, and I've accepted that. And the exit, which needs to happen on my terms, not hers." She said she's waiting for the Meridian announcement before she files. She thinks she can include the project's value in a settlement claim. "She can't," David said. "Not the Cavendish stake, not structured the way it is." "I know that. Her solicitor will work it out eventually, but eventually is the key word. So you want to control the timing." "I want to control the timing," I confirmed. "And I want to do it in a way that makes the situation absolutely unambiguous, not just legally, but in every other sense. Claire's family has been building a particular narrative about me for several years. I would like that narrative to be publicly corrected." David was quiet for a long moment. Then a small, dry smile moved across his face, the rarest smile of a man who almost never smiles without reason. "The Ashworth Charity Gala," he said, "second Friday of December. They've invited us," I said. "They always invite us, 200 guests, every business contact Richard has ever cultivated. Half the city's planning and development sector. I can have the full Meridian documentation, design credits, equity structure, projected valuations, formatted into a presentation package by the end of November. I'll need 2 copies of the Cavendish legal summary. One for the table, one for me to keep." "Done." He looked at me steadily. "And you're all right." It was the only time he asked that question. He asked it once directly and waited for an honest answer. "No," I said. "But I'm clear." He nodded. That was enough. That was David. "I'll be there at 7:15, he said. "I'll have the folder." The 6 weeks between that dinner and the Ashworth Charity Gala were the strangest 6 weeks of my life. I went home every evening. I sat across the table from my wife. I asked about her day with the particular attentiveness I had always brought to our conversations, and I listened to the answers with the knowledge that she had asked Julian Hargrove the same question a few hours earlier in a hotel suite on Devereux Street. I did not show what I knew. I did not sharpen my voice or let coldness into my manner. I was, and I want to be precise about this, kind, not because I had forgiven her, but because cruelty would have told her something was wrong, and something being wrong would have changed her timeline, and her changing her timeline would have interfered with mine. An architect does not pour the concrete before the foundations have cured. You wait for the right conditions, then you build. I spoke to my solicitor, a woman named Frances Drummond, 47, forensically intelligent, who had handled the Cavendish Incorporation and whom I trusted completely. I briefed her on the likely divorce proceedings. She confirmed that the Cavendish stake, properly structured with the current documentation, was protected from a settlement claim with a very high degree of certainty. She advised me on what to prepare. I prepared it. I confirmed our attendance at the gala, 2 seats. Friday, December the 13th, drinks from 7, dinner at 8, black tie. I had my dress suit cleaned and pressed. I bought a new shirt. I polished my shoes on the Thursday evening before the gala while Claire was, she told me, working late. I placed the leather portfolio that David had prepared on the shelf in my office. Black leather, slim, containing 12 pages of documentation. The Meridian architectural credits, the Cavendish equity structure, the projected return figures, and the legal summary of its protection from marital settlement claims. I had read it 3 times. I did not need to read it again. I knew every figure, every page, every line. The titanium key card sat on my desk beside the portfolio. I picked it up, put it in the breast pocket of my dinner jacket. Felt its weight there, not heavy, not significant to any outside eye, but present, solid, exactly where it had always been. I was ready. The Ashworth Charity Gala was held at Meridian House, a venue whose name, given what was about to happen inside it, carries a particular irony that I did not plan but did not fail to notice. A mid-century building in the city's old financial quarter, all marble and high ceilings and the well-maintained grandeur of spaces that exist primarily to remind people of their own importance. We arrived at 7:10. Claire was in a navy dress and the diamond earrings her father had given her for her 30th birthday. She looked beautiful. She was nervous in the way she always was at her family's events, not anxious exactly, but calibrated. Performing a version of herself for a room that expected a specific thing. The room was full. 200 people in black tie, crystal glasses, the orchestrated warmth of a well-funded gathering. The Ashworths were in their element. Richard was near the bar, broad and commanding, working the room in the manner of a man who has never once doubted his right to be at its center. He was speaking to Gerald Prentice and 2 other men I recognized as property developers, his voice carrying that specific note of proprietary satisfaction he reserved for events he had either organized or substantially sponsored. He saw us arrive. He raised a glass in our direction, a gestural acknowledgement, not a welcome. Marcus was already somewhat loosened by drink, positioned near a cluster of people by the room's central pillar, his laughter audible at 20 feet. He saw me and crossed the room with the warmth of a man who has completely misread the temperature of every interaction he has ever had with me. Nathan, looking sharp, the quiet man in the corner, he grinned. "Don't think I've ever seen you in a dinner jacket before." "Marcus," I said. "Big night for the family," he said, with the proprietorial pride of a man who had contributed nothing to the evening's organization. "Dad's raised $240,000 for the hospice this year. Not bad, right?" "Impressive," I said. He clapped me on the shoulder and drifted back to his group. Claire had moved toward her mother. I stood alone for a moment in the middle of the room, my right hand resting lightly against my jacket's breast pocket, feeling the slim edge of the key card beneath the fabric. At 7:15 precisely, my phone vibrated once. A message from David, in the lobby. "Come get the folder when you're ready." I excused myself from a conversation I was barely in, walked to the lobby, and found David standing by the cloakroom, dressed immaculately, holding a slim black leather portfolio. He handed it to me without ceremony. "Everything's in there, figures as of this morning. Meridian broke ground on schedule. The press release goes out at 9 a.m. tomorrow." "Thank you," I said. "Nathan," his voice was level. "You're certain?" "Completely," I said. He nodded once. A single measured nod that contained, from David, the full weight of his support. I took the portfolio. I went back into the room. Richard Ashworth's address to the gathered guests came at 7:45 before they were called to dinner. He stood at the room's small podium with the ease of a man who has given hundreds of speeches and understood on an instinctive level that the room was his. He spoke well. He always spoke well. He talked about the hospice charity, about the years the family had supported it, about the importance of building something that outlasted individual success. "What I've always believed," Richard said, his voice resonant and steady, "is that a man's legacy is built not on what he earns, but on what he leaves behind, on the foundations he lays for the people who come after him. The strength of those foundations is everything." He raised his glass, the room raised theirs, I raised mine. I looked at Richard Ashworth over the rim of my glass, this man who had called me a comfortable old chair, who had offered me Surrey jobs and in-house roles as though my ambitions were simply a misunderstanding I hadn't yet corrected, who had sat in his drawing room and laughed at the idea that I might one day build something worth remembering, and I felt, for the first time all evening, something that was not patience or calculation or cold professional clarity. I felt briefly and almost imperceptibly the way I imagine a demolitions expert feels when the charges are already set and the only thing left is the particular inevitability of physics. I set my glass down. Dinner was called. I waited until the main course had been cleared. This was deliberate. A room at the end of the first course is still partially elsewhere, still landing, still finding its rhythm. A room at the end of the main course is settled, comfortable, present. The wine has had time to work, the attention is fuller. The silences between conversations are deeper. I stood up. The table seated 12, Richard at one end, Helen to his right, Marcus beside her. Claire to my left, looking at me with a small, curious expression. I never stood during dinner. It was not something I did. Gerald Prentice across from me, a property developer named Susan Marlowe and her husband. Two of Richard's oldest business partners, men who had known the family for 30 years. An audience that Richard Ashworth had spent 30 years curating for exactly this purpose, to witness him. "I hope you'll forgive me," I said. My voice was level. I did not project it. The table was small enough. "I have something I'd like to share. It's relevant to a few conversations we've had over the years. I hope you'll indulge me for a few minutes." Richard looked at me with a measured expression, not alarmed, not yet. "Of course, Nathan," he said, in the tone of someone extending a courtesy. I opened the leather portfolio and placed one copy of the document package face down in front of me. I placed the second copy face down in the center of the table where Richard could reach it. Then I placed the titanium key card on top of the portfolio in front of me. The room was quiet, with the particular quality of a room that is sensed without yet understanding that something has shifted. In the moments after I placed the key card on the table and before I spoke again, I was aware of the room in a way I am rarely aware of rooms, the temperature of it, the quality of the silence, the particular stillness of people who have understood that something has become irrevocable. Gerald Prentice had set down his wine glass. Susan Marlowe was looking at her husband with an expression that communicated, in the efficient shorthand of long marriages, that she was processing something significant. Richard's two oldest business partners, men named Douglas Hale and Patrick Crane, both in their mid-60s, both of whom had been investing alongside Richard since the early 90s, were looking at the document that Richard held, and then at me, with the particular professional attention of men who have learned to read a situation before committing to a response. What I noticed most was Marcus. Marcus, who at Helen's birthday lunch had asked me about my magnum opus with the bright cruelty of a man who was certain he already knew the answer. Marcus, who had offered me Surrey architecture jobs and graphics roles with the generous condescension of someone distributing charity. Marcus, who had made, on at least 6 separate occasions in my presence and certainly more in my absence, some version of the joke that I was brilliant at designing things that never quite got built. He was sitting very still. He was not a man built for stillness. It did not suit him. It made him look, for the first time since I had known him, like someone who was genuinely uncertain about what to do next. His wine glass was in his hand and he had stopped drinking from it. He was looking at the title page of the document, Meridian Development Project, and I watched him read the figure, £342 million. He looked up at me. I did not give him anything. Not satisfaction, not contempt, not the validation of seeing that his reaction had registered. I simply looked at him with the same level, unhurried attention I had always brought to things worth understanding, and then I looked back at Richard and I continued. "The Meridian design credits will be listed in tomorrow's council announcement," I said. "Cole Architecture and Associates, lead design. You will likely see my name in several publications over the coming weeks. If you search the company's house register for Cavendish Strategic Holdings and cross-reference with the Meridian Development documentation, you will find the equity stake I described. All of it is verifiable. None of it requires you to take my word for it." Richard looked up from the document at last. He was a man of 61 years who had made everything he had through the force of his own understanding of how the world worked, and he was sitting at a dinner table looking at evidence that his understanding had been, in at least one material respect, critically incomplete. "Nathan," he said, his voice was steady. "I will give him that. Whatever else Richard Ashworth was, he was not a man who crumbled easily. I had no idea." "I know," I said. "That was rather the point." There was another silence. "The kind that lands and stays." Helen reached across and placed her hand on Richard's arm, a gesture so habitual it seemed unconscious, the automatic steadying of a long marriage. Douglas Hale, one of the business partners, cleared his throat, not to speak, simply because the silence needed acknowledging. I looked at my wife one final time. Claire had not moved since I mentioned the phone call. The legal document I had slid toward her remained face down on the tablecloth beside her dessert fork. Her hands were folded in her lap. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Claire," I said quietly. "I genuinely do," she did not respond. Her eyes met mine for a moment, and in that moment I saw something cross her face that was not the coolness I had braced for and not the defensiveness I had half expected, but something softer and less composed than either. Something that looked, if I am honest, like the first real thing I had seen from her in a long time. I did not let myself read into it. I had spent too many months reading accurately. I was not going to start reading charitably now. I picked up my key card. I placed it in my breast pocket. I thanked the table for their time. I left. 4 years ago, I said, "Richard, you offered me a position at Ashworth Developments. You described it as a more stable footing." I was grateful for the thought. I declined. Richard's expression didn't change. He nodded slightly. "6 months after that, Marcus, you suggested a residential render role through one of your father's contacts. You said, and I remember this clearly, that perhaps the commercial instinct just wasn't there." Marcus smiled with the reflexive ease of a man who doesn't yet know he should be worried. "And Richard, at a dinner here in February, you described me to Gerald." I looked at Gerald Prentice across the table, who had gone very still, as a comfortable old chair, kind, predictable. Not something you'd build a room around. The silence at the table was now a different quality of silence. Richard's expression had shifted by a degree that, if you were watching him closely, was considerable. Helen's hand had moved to her wine glass. Claire was looking at me with an expression I could not entirely read. "I am telling you this not to embarrass anyone," I said, "but because I think clarity is important. And because what I am about to tell you requires that context." I turned the portfolio over. The document was visible now, its title page reading, Meridian Development Project, Cole Architecture and Associates / Cavendish Strategic Holdings, Financial and Design Summary. "The Meridian Project," I said, 47 stories, former industrial waterfront, mixed residential and commercial use, public arts facility, integrated transport connection. Total development value, £342 million. Ground was broken on schedule last week. I let that sit for a moment. Cole Architecture and Associates holds the lead design contract we have for 6 years. I have been the lead architect on this project since the master plan was submitted to the city council." Richard had picked up the copy from the center of the table. He was looking at the title page with the expression of a man whose vision has suddenly had to adjust to a different focal length. "Through a separate holding company," I continued, "I hold a 17% equity stake in the Meridian development. That stake was acquired over 4 years at a total investment of £11 million. At projected completion, it represents a return." I picked up my key card, turned it once between my fingers, "of £58,140,000. The table was absolutely silent. Marcus was looking at me with an expression that was no longer smiling. Gerald Prentice was looking at his hands. "The lead design credit will be formally announced by the council's press office tomorrow morning," I said. "The Cavendish equity stake is a matter of public record through the relevant filings, though it requires some care to trace. I have saved you the work." I set the key card down on the table, not dramatically, quietly. "The way you place a document you no longer need to carry." I looked at Richard. "You asked 4 years ago whether I had considered a more stable footing. I had, Richard. This is what it looked like." I looked at Marcus. "You told me the commercial instinct wasn't there. £342 million, 17%, 6 years of work conducted, without exception, in the building you have been referring to as my little office." Marcus opened his mouth. He closed it. "I don't say any of this with hostility," I said. "I say it because it is true, and because the truth of a structure matters. You cannot build on a false understanding of what is load-bearing." I turned to Claire. She was looking at me with the particular expression of someone who has been informed, without warning, that the terrain they believed they were standing on is different from what they assumed. Not guilty, not yet. Something precursor to that. Something like the moment before a diagnosis when the doctor's face has already told you. "I overheard your conversation with your mother," I said. "The one in the kitchen, about timing." The color left Claire's face by a precise degree. "I know about Julian. I know about the hotel on Devereux Street. I know that you've been waiting for the Meridian announcement to file for divorce, and I know that you intended the project's value to inform your settlement claim." I slid the second document toward her, the Cavendish Legal Summary, annotated by Francis Drummond. This is the legal summary of the Cavendish equity structure. As you'll see from page 4, the stake is held through a corporate structure that predates our marriage by 14 months and is fully protected from any marital settlement claim under current statute. I have been advised by counsel the position is unambiguous. Claire looked at the document. She did not pick it up. I am not raising this to be punitive, I said. I am raising it because I believe that where you start from matters. And I think it's important that we all start from the same accurate understanding of where we are. I looked at Richard one final time. He had not spoken since I stood up. He was a man who was accustomed to being the most consequential person in a room, and he was sitting in a room in which that was no longer true, and he was discovering that he did not know what to do with that. You build on integrity, Richard, I said, or you don't build at all. I closed the portfolio. I picked up my key card, placed it in my breast pocket. I thanked the table for their time, excused myself, and walked across the room. I collected my coat from the lobby. I left. I did not feel triumphant. What I felt, and I want to be honest about this, was a profound and almost unbearable sadness. For the 6 years I had genuinely loved. For the specific person Claire had been before I understood the conditions attached to that love. For the particular grief of seeing someone clearly for the first time and realizing the clarity has come too late to do anything with except accept it. I sat in my car in the car park for a long time in the dark. Then I drove home, sat on the kitchen floor with Pip's head in my lap, and for the first time in 4 months, allowed myself to feel everything I had been keeping at exactly the temperature of the room. The weeks that followed had the quality of a building in the process of controlled demolition, each element coming down in sequence, each collapse following from the one before it, the whole structure reduced not to chaos but to cleared ground. Claire moved out of the house 18 days after the gala. She went to her parents first, then to a flat in the city's northern quarter. She did not contest the Cavendish stake. Francis Drummond confirmed, 3 weeks after their solicitor had reviewed the documentation, that they had accepted the position with no further challenge. The divorce proceedings were civil and largely administrative. We split the joint account, the furniture, and 9 years of small domestic accumulations with a quietness that felt, given everything, like its own form of honesty. She took Pip twice a week. Whatever else was true, Claire had loved the dog genuinely. Some things are not conditional. Richard Ashworth's response to the gala was not immediate, but it was, eventually, thorough. Gerald Prentice, who had sat across the table and heard everything, was a man whose professional world overlapped considerably with Richard's. Within 3 weeks of the gala, 2 of Richard's development bids in the city's planning pipeline had quietly acquired competing submissions from a consortium Gerald was understood to be advising. One of those bids, for a commercial development in the eastern zone, Richard had considered a formality. It was no longer a formality. Word moves in the development sector the way water moves through old architecture. Along every available channel, through every gap, and eventually into the foundations, whether you want it there or not. By February, Richard had withdrawn from the Hospice Charities Board. The announcement cited strategic refocusing of philanthropic commitments. His oldest business partners had read the room with the professional precision that old business partners always deploy when they sense that a long association has begun to represent a liability rather than an asset. He did not lose his empire. I want to be clear about that. Richard Ashworth remained a wealthy and influential man. But he was a wealthy and influential man who had stood at a podium and spoken about the importance of foundations, who had smiled at a toast and laughed in a drawing room, and offered Surrey architects jobs to a man who was 6 months from having his name attached to the most significant development contract in the city's recent history, and now every person who had been in that room knew it. The informal empire of social respect that Richard had built over 30 years is, in some ways, more fragile than the financial one. It requires consistent agreement. It requires that everyone around you maintains the same fiction. The moment one person in the room sees behind it, the whole thing acquires a different structural integrity. Marcus's consequence was simpler and more public. In the weeks after the gala, he had apparently told the story in the way Marcus told all stories, which was loudly and with embellishments designed to make himself the most interesting character in it, to a number of people within the Ashworth circle. His version cast the whole evening as a crude power play, a man making a scene at a charity dinner to settle a private grievance. The problem with this version was that the documentation was publicly traceable. The Meridian project was by now in every architectural publication in the country, and several of the people Marcus had told the story to had already read about Cole Architecture and Associates and the Cavendish stake before he had a chance to frame it. The story he had been telling about me, the comfortable chair, the little office, the man who somehow never quite built anything real, collided head-on with the actual public record, and the collision was not kind to Marcus. He was, last I heard, still at Ashworth Developments, but the role had become quieter. The borrowed authority of his father's name had lost some of its lending power. He had, I was told, stopped telling the story. The Meridian press release went out at 9 a.m. on the Friday morning after the gala, as scheduled. The architectural press coverage was extensive. The project was significant by any measure in its scale, its design ambition, its integration of public and commercial space, its engagement with the waterfront's industrial history. Several publications ran profiles on Cole Architecture and Associates. One of the larger architectural journals ran a full feature on the Cavendish equity model, a small independent firm building a minority stake in its own commission, holding it through construction, turning design work into long-term financial participation. It was described as a model that other practices should study. The profile ran with a photograph of me at the Meridian site, standing in front of the groundwork in a coat that needed dry cleaning. I am not looking at the camera in the photograph, I am looking at the structure. I sent a copy to no one, I kept it in a folder in my office. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in March, 4 months after the gala. A handwritten envelope in the post, addressed in Claire's handwriting, which I recognized as easily as I recognized her voice. I held the envelope for a moment in the hallway, then set it on the kitchen counter and made myself a coffee before I opened it. It was not a long letter, 3 pages, handwritten in the careful and slightly formal style Claire adopted when she was saying something she had thought about extensively before committing it to paper. I will not reproduce it in full because some things belong to the people they were written between, but I will tell you what it contained. It did not ask for anything, not forgiveness, not a conversation, not a reconsideration of any legal or financial position. She stated that explicitly in the first paragraph, and I believed her, because Claire had never been a person who wasted words approaching something indirectly. What it contained was an acknowledgement. A direct, unembellished admission of what she had done and how she had done it, written in the clear declarative sentences of someone who had decided that honesty was the only useful thing she had left to offer. She wrote about Julian not with the self-justifying framing of someone performing remorse, but with the flat specificity of someone reporting facts they are no longer interested in defending. She wrote about the hotel, about the timing conversation with her mother, about the calculations she had made and the exit she had planned. She wrote, in the letter's final page, about her father. About the degree to which his framework, wealth equals worth, stability equals value, visible success equals evidence of character, had become so completely her own that she had stopped seeing it as a framework at all and had simply been living inside it. About the particular cruelty of applying that framework to someone who was, as she now understood, building something extraordinary in complete and deliberate silence. I am not writing to ask for anything, the letter said near its end. I just needed you to know that I understand now what I failed to understand then, and that the failure was mine. I read the letter twice. Then I set it on the kitchen counter and looked at it for a long time. I did not reply. I have not replied, but I have not deleted it or discarded it or done any of the things that bitterness recommends. I keep it in a drawer in the kitchen, unremarkably, without ceremony, in the way you keep something that has found its correct place in the account of things. What I have done in the months since the gala is work. The Meridian project is 22 months from completion. I am on site 2 days a week. David and I are negotiating a second equity stake in a development in the city's northern waterfront, smaller than Meridian, but structured along the same model, with what we have learned applied to make it cleaner and more efficient. I have taken on 2 graduate architects who are, both of them, considerably smarter than I was at their age, which I count as a professional achievement. Pip sleeps under my desk when Claire doesn't have him. He has developed a habit of sitting with his chin on my foot while I work, which I pretend to find inconvenient and which I would not change for anything. I walk past the Meridian site most mornings on my way into the office. I watch the structure rising from its foundation, the steel frame climbing the skyline in its specific, deliberate sequence, each floor dependent on the one below it, the whole thing built from the bottom up, nothing above supported without what is underneath being exactly right. I think about foundations a great deal. I always have. I think about the fact that the most important structural work happens underground before anything is visible, before any observer would know that anything significant is being made. I think about the patience that requires and the certainty it demands, the certainty that what you are making is worth the time it takes to make it correctly, even when the people around you cannot see it and have decided, based on what is visible to them, that nothing of significance is happening. I think about what it cost. I want to be clear-eyed about this. It cost something real. Not the marriage, which I had lost before I understood I was losing it, but the specific years in which I had genuinely believed something that turned out not to be entirely true. That cost does not go away because the ending was, in material terms, favorable. Some losses are not canceled by subsequent gains. They are simply absorbed and carried until they become part of the foundation too. The story of Nathan Cole is not, in the end, a story about revenge. I want to say that clearly because I think that framing misses the point entirely. It is a story about what happens when a person decides that their work is the truest answer to the question of who they are, and then builds accordingly, without performance, without announcement, and without the particular small cruelty of requiring anyone else's acknowledgement in order to continue. Richard Ashworth was not wrong that foundations matter. He was wrong about what foundations are made of. He built his on visibility and other people's confirmation. Nathan built his on the work itself, on 6 years of drawings and revisions and planning negotiations and structural compromises and long nights in the office and the quiet, accumulated certainty of something being correctly made. Richard's foundation shifted the moment the room changed. Nathan's did not. Whatever else the Meridian Project becomes, and it will become many things over the years. Buildings acquire lives that outlast the intentions of the people who made them. It will always be, first and most accurately, a 47-story answer to every assumption that was never corrected in real time because the most convincing correction was always going to be the building itself. Build on integrity or don't build at all. We'd love to hear from you. Do you think Nathan was right to wait to build his case in silence and choose his moment, or should he have confronted Claire the night he overheard that phone call? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. There are no wrong answers here, and we read every single one. If Nathan's story stayed with you, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this one, and every subscription means we can keep telling them. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next one.